Thank you, everyone. Very good morning. It's actually quite strange that I'm perfectly okay standing up. I was an MLA before I became an MP, and I was perfectly okay addressing political rallies with 10, 20,000 people. I'm perfectly okay being in the assembly. I was perfectly okay being in parliament. But whenever I come into something like this, especially to a school, I think in my head, I'm still 11 years old, and I keep thinking of assembly morning and, when the days when we had school functions. And we were all asked to polish our shoes and make sure our white socks were just the right length and everyone should have behaved. And we had the check and we were sitting quietly and nothing goes wrong. So I'm actually feeling exceedingly nervous. So when I go in and speak to students or in a situation like this, I feel like I'm quite unworthy of it and I feel quite nervous. So you'll have to bear with me. But it's absolutely wonderful to be here. It's a fabulous. It takes me back to my school days. I went to a school very much like this, and I knew all the three hymns that were there. So that was, I think, along with Anant, I scored quite well on that one. But it's wonderful to see you all and the girls and boys together. I went to all-girls school, so seeing you all together, very disciplined, very clean, fabulous, you know, school buildings and grounds and everything. So congratulations. Mine wasn't half as good. And so let me start. When Mrs. Koshi sent me the topic and she said the low road less traveled, obviously everyone thinks of the Robert Frost poem, which is The Road Not Taken. And Frost used to go walking with this friend of his who was also a poet. And this friend, whichever way they walked, would come back and say, maybe we should have taken the other way. Maybe that would have been better. So the choice is always, do you take a road where you can see a bend in it, or do you take a road which you don't know what it's about? That's always the choice. I'm going to be quite honest and tell you a few things. When you're in school, and when I was in school, I really fit the straight and narrow path. I used to always study academically. There was my sister and I. I was always, my parents never had to tell me to study. I was always very keen. If I came second instead of coming first, I'd go into a complete depression and cry and howl and do all of these things. So I was very committed. And I was always what, unfortunately, in slang was termed a smartass. So that's what I was always in school, and I was always the person who knew the answer and would study, would put the hand up, tried to ace every exam, blah, blah, blah. And I did that, and I won, like Anant was saying here, that when 11 and 12, Mrs. Matthew gave him a scholarship. So I too, after class 12, wanted to go to the US to study, and I applied to all the US colleges. In those days, we had to give our SAT and we could apply to, I think, 10 colleges, 8 or 10. So I applied, and at the end of it, I got into Princeton and I got into Mount Holyoke. But I didn't get any financial aid in Princeton. So obviously the choice for me was to go to Mount Holyoke, which was one of the 7 sister colleges in Massachusetts. So I think this was, more than 24 years ago that I first went to college. And nowadays, I see a lot of parents who take their kids, and I see a lot of my friends who say, where are you going for the summer? And they're like, we're going to check out colleges for our children. And then what else are you doing? No, we are going to Bombay to find tutors who can help our children study for the SAT and write the perfect essay. And then I find people, when their children get in, where are you going? Oh, we are going in August, we're going to go settle our child in, buy her everything, put her into the dorm room, set her in and come back. Now, unfortunately, I never had any of those luxuries or privileges, you may call it. I came from a very solid upper middle class stock. My parents were working, my mother was a housewife, my father was a working man. And we always had enough to eat and all of that. But the thought of my parents going to drop me or to kit out my room were things that were unheard of. It was obvious I would study on a scholarship. And while I was on campus, it was obvious that I would work on campus to pay for my, bills. So I got a campus job. I used to wash dishes my first year. And then after that, as you graduate, first year, everyone washes dishes in the US. So when you get to second year, you try and get better jobs. And then I became a TA because I was good at math. I became a teaching assistant in the math department. And then I remember when you wash dishes, you got $4.75 an hour. But when you graduated to teaching, you got $5.50. So that was fine. And then, you did your internship. So even in college, I think I was a good student. I was very keen. I wanted to study. I was doing economics and math. And I graduated, and then, of course, for economics and math, if you're in an East Coast liberal arts college, the choice was, for all of us, investment banking. It was the glamorous thing to do. All the big investment banks, all the bulge brackets bank, Goldman Sachs, in those days Bear Stearns, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, they all came to campus and they held interviews and they would hire us. So for me, I had a roommate who was going to take a year off and travel in Africa and then go to film school. Now for me, the option of going to film school or traveling for a year or taking a gap year simply was not an option. Because I had college loans and I knew that I have to get a job and pay that back. It was pretty clear that I would not have the option of doing that. So I think till college, till I graduated from college and went to work, I really didn't have a choice to take the road less traveled. Do you get what I mean? I never had the option. I took the straight and narrow path because for me at that point in life, I didn't have a lot of options. I had to go to school, I had to do well, I had to win a scholarship, I had to study hard, I had to get good grades and graduate from Mount Holyoke, I had to get a job at a good investment bank that paid me a good salary so I could pay back my loan. So till then, I never had the option, like a lot of kids have nowadays, of going to summer school in Switzerland and figuring out what they want to do. Or in class 10 or 11, take lots of classes and figure out what they had to do. I didn't have those choices of even thinking about taking the road less traveled. I always took the straight and narrow because that was the way it was. And a lot of people in our generation took that. So I have no regrets. I think that gave me a discipline, and I think it taught me to really keep my head down and do what I needed to do. And then I entered JP Morgan as an analyst investment bank. And there was a class of 123. So I think in my life, everything was a learning process. And this is something I hope some of you will think about, is when you're in school, by the time you get to class 12, like you have your head girl here, she's head girl, she's well respected. I was also a prefect. You think you're smart, you think you can rule the world. Then you go into college, and then you find, if you go to a good college, everyone there is either a prefect or a head girl from somewhere or the other, right? So you start feeling stupid all over again. Then you take 4 years to study hard, and by the time you graduate, you're at the top of your class, you feel like I'm really smart. Like I graduated Summa, I was really smart. Then you go to JP Morgan, and there are 123 people in your analyst class who are superstars from every school, every college, all over the world. So then again, you feel like an idiot. So every 3 to 4 years in your life, it's about thinking that I'm surrounded by people smarter than me. And I think that is a very important learning process in life. There is no point in being a big fish in a small pond. You must always, always, always struggle to be a small fish in a big pond. Because that's when you push yourself and bring out the best. So there were a lot of people who could go and work with a different bank. I chose to work with JP Morgan. It was tough. I mean, we spent the first 3 years. I remember the first year I never came back to India because we pulled all-nighters. You're on a big deal. You're on a big M&A deal. And you are working, literally, I didn't take a weekend off my first year. I worked all the time. There were days I didn't do laundry for 2 weeks. I'd go out and buy a new white shirt because I had no clothes, because there was no time to do laundry. And it wasn't just me. It was all of us who went through that kind of ritual. And I think that taught us something. I remember my first boss, after I graduated from Mount Holyoke and I was really smart, I got into JP Morgan. My first boss was a man called Paul Gibbs. And he said, can you go print this paper out for me? And I said, I've just had a $100,000 education. I've graduated Summa. What is he, stupid? What is he asking me to print a piece of paper out? I printed a piece of paper out and brought it to him. And he folded it in half. And he said, it's not aligned. Right? He said, it's not aligned in the middle. It was an Excel sheet with numbers on it. So he says, when you print out something, you must always have that alignment. So I went through 3 years at JP Morgan at the analyst training program, where one thing you learn is attention to detail. No matter how menial the task, we had all graduated top of our class, been to top universities, graduated mathematics, economics, but whether it was photocopying, whether it was making a PowerPoint presentation, whether it was doing the most menial tasks, you didn't say no. You just learned everything. And I think that's something that all of us in our life need to do. When we were kids, and I don't know how many of you do this anymore, we used to have black shoes and PT shoes. So the day there was PT, my sister and I still remember we used to get that white paint. Do you remember the white paint? So we'd sit the night before and we'd paint our kids' shoes with that and then put it out to dry and go. I don't think people do that anymore. But I just think that anything in your school life where if you do it yourself, if you pack your bed yourself, if you make your bed yourself before you leave to school, if you carry your bag yourself, I see a lot, and I'm not putting a judgment call on this, but I think it's something all of you kids need to think about, is if you're getting out of the car, sometimes I see the person who's driving your car or your helper holding the bag or holding your water bottle. You must always learn to do your own work, because when that makes it that much easier. Like, I went from living the high life in investment banking to becoming an MLA from the Bangladesh border, where I didn't have a toilet and I didn't have drinking water. But I adjusted simply because in our childhood, we weren't used to luxuries and you could learn everything. So whatever it is, I know parents nowadays, as all of us, we want to give our children the best, and sometimes, parents give all of you the best. But in that, if you are going to ever take the road less traveled, you must always, during your childhood, during these formative years, try and do everything possible and try and learn everything possible. Whether it's making your own bed, whether it's making your own food, whether it's making your own Maggie, whether it's making all of those things. You must be able to, like I said, bathe yourself, feed yourself, and live without your parents by the time you're 14. It's very, very important. These are life skills that you must learn. It's exceedingly important. So I finished and graduated from, I went to work for JP Morgan, I worked in New York and London and a lot of other offices, and I was happy. I went back for my 10th reunion to my college, to Mount Holyoke, and most of us who had been in banking by then were senior vice presidents, about to become managing directors. All of us were earning very well, had good lives, a few of us had children, all of that. And I remember being in Mount Holyoke, and 99% of my class were exceedingly successful, but they were all homogeneous, if you know what I'm saying. They were all pretty much led the same kind of life. And there were only about 5 or 6 people in our graduating class who had done different things. So there was a girl in my class, and she was already by then a senator from New Hampshire. There was another girl who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and she had been reporting on the war in Afghanistan. So there were a few of them which stood out. And I remember on the way back, thinking about this and saying, do I want to come back for my 20th reunion or my 25th reunion, being another managing director at JP Morgan, or do I want to come back having made a difference? So that's when I had the aha moment, and that's when I had been working for 10 or 11 years, I had got some element of financial security, and I had the option of taking the road less traveled. Till then, to be honest, I had never had the option of taking the road less traveled. So that's when I had the option of taking the road less traveled, and then I took a decision. I was 30 years old, and I said, you know what, I'm not going to talk about it anymore. I'm going to go back, and I want to do grassroots politics in India. And I literally knew nobody. I knew nobody. And they say in politics that you need to have money, you need to have muscle, you need to have all of those things in Indian politics. Everyone said, Mahua, there are sharks out there. They'll eat you up. It's dirty. It's corrupt. You don't know anyone. Your father's not an MP. It's impossible. But that's what I want to tell you. Nothing is impossible. I am living proof that nothing is impossible. If you want to do something, just do it. And never have a plan B. I know this is probably very bad advice, and after I leave, your teachers are going to tell you this is terrible advice. Always have a plan B, always have a plan C. Give the UPSC, then give your state services, then give something else. But for me, when I wanted to do something, a lot of people said, don't quit your job. Take a sabbatical for a year, go back and try politics and come back. And I knew in my head, if I didn't quit my job, and I always had that background of a well-paying, secure thing back in London, I would never give it my all in politics. I would never. So I knew I had to quit my job. I knew I had to come to do politics where I had nothing to go back to. And that's when I would struggle and I would claw my way through it. So that's what worked for me. So I think not having a plan B gives you the strength always to take the road less traveled. It's exactly like you were saying. It says, you want to be the city that stands on the hill. You do want to be the city that stands on the hill because everyone can see you. And I was very clear that I wanted to get there. But when something is built on a hill, it's always more difficult to build. So when I came back and I wanted to join politics, I went to the Congress and joined the Youth Congress and joined a very basic grassroots program in Bengal, which was doing booth organization work. So it was basically going village to village. The lowest, you all have done civics. You must have civics, don't you have civics? You have civics? So in civics, when you go to vote, and I think none of you vote, but when your parents do, they'll go to the nearby school, which is a polling booth. So a polling booth is the smallest, is the sort of lowest structure. So every village has 1 or 2 polling booths. So what we would do in the Youth Congress was go booth to booth and popularize the government schemes. So there are loads and loads of government schemes out there, but most people don't know about it because our people are illiterate. They get scared when they've got to fill out forms. So even though there's money available, there's services available, but simply because people don't know and they don't have people assisting them in telling them about these schemes and helping them do it, they lose out on it. So our work literally was to go booth to booth. There are 80,000 booths in Bengal, and do it. So I started doing that, and it was very hard work, but I persevered. And then after a year, I joined the Trinamool Congress, which was obviously an offshoot of the Congress because the Congress party didn't have very much left in Bengal. And I worked there, and I got a ticket to run from the Trinamool Congress as a member of the Legislative Assembly in Bengal. Now the seat I got was it's called Karimpur, and you can go and Google it. It's the very last seat in Bengal on the Bangladesh border. It's got Bangladesh, Kushtia on one side and India on the other, and the border fencing project. So India has about 4,500 kilometers of border with Bangladesh. Now most of the border has been fenced, but a lot of it has still not been fenced because it's a riverine border. So since it's a riverine border, there's a problem setting up a fence. So my area has 122 kilometers of unfenced border. So you have a little rivulet running through, you Bangladesh on the other. Now that obviously comes with its own share of problems. I was the first non-left MLA to win the seat in 46 years. And it was a tough seat because it was, it's a border seat, you have arms smuggling, you have cattle smuggling, you have a lot of things that normally an urban constituency or South Delhi or North Delhi will not have. But it was fine. It was a real learning process. I did that for 5 years. And then I ran for parliament and came to parliament this time. So I think it's been a wonderful journey. It's been a very tough journey. But I think there are a couple of things that I think that people ask me that, you came from being in banking and then you came to politics. How do you adjust? And I say one thing. I said, in my head, I am not too attached to things around me. So like I said, in our childhood, we didn't grow up with a lot of things that we became attached to. We didn't think that an air conditioner was important to go to sleep in. I didn't go to sleep in, we didn't go to school in air-conditioned buses. We didn't even have, I think there was load shedding. There used to be power cuts in Calcutta all the time when we were growing up. So most of our classrooms were without fans. But now I feel really hot, but in those days, obviously, it didn't bother us. So I think the fact that we never gave a lot of importance to material comforts makes it that much easier when you're traversing the road less traveled because you don't think about all these things. If you start thinking about, oh my God, I need to go to a nice place, I need to go have a nice meal now, and I need to go and do this, I need to go and do that, then it becomes that much difficult. But the most important thing is, it's all in your own head. If you in your own head are okay with where you are, then you're okay. For me, it doesn't matter if I'm here, or tomorrow I'll be in Nadia in the constituency, or day after that I could be in England. It doesn't make a difference. You are who you are no matter what. And we must all strive to be global citizens. So wherever we are, we must be ourselves. We can't change ourselves depending on what the sort of circumstances demand of us. That's very, very important. A lot of people ask me that what is common between investment banking and politics. And I always say there are 3 things that are common, I think, between any successful career, any successful. So if you want to be the top 1% of lawyers, you want to be the top 1% in doctors, you want to be the top 1% in politicians, the most important thing is discipline. You have to be disciplined. You have to, like for example, I went through a long period of time when I wasn't elected. Now when you're not elected and you're doing organization work, it takes a lot of discipline to wake up in the morning because you're not seeing the goal immediately. You're not seeing the ticket. You're not seeing a winning ticket. You're not seeing parliament in front of you. But to get up in the morning and to just go and do your work, go do village to village for 12 hours a day requires that discipline. And that's very important. So whatever you set your mind to do, you must have discipline. The second thing is tenacity, is don't give up. For me, I think the only reason I succeeded in politics in spite of so many ups and downs over the last 10 years was because I didn't give up. There are times when the first ticket Mamata Banerjee gave me was from a different constituency, Jalangi. I didn't take the ticket. And everyone said, Mahua, if you refuse Mamata Banerjee's ticket, your political life is over. But I stuck it out and I kept working and I got the ticket ultimately from my own district, which I won. So tenacity is very important. Don't give up. Even if you're not on the reserve bench, even if you're not playing or you're not on the reserve bench, at least if you're bringing in the drinks trolley, make sure you're on the field. Do not leave the field. So being tenacious is very important. And the third thing is you have to be hardworking. There is nothing which is an antidote to hard work. There is no alternative. I have seen very smart people in my life. When I entered Mount Holyoke, I had people who were much smarter than I was, and you would think that they'd do very well in life. I see them today, I can't even find where they were because they didn't have a good work ethic. So in life, remember that even if you are not that smart, but you work very hard, you will do much better than somebody who's super intelligent but who doesn't have a good work ethic, right? So it's like if you have a brilliant idea but it's poorly executed, it's no point. Even if you have a mediocre idea and it's well executed, it'll probably end up doing well. So discipline, tenacity, and hard work. There is nothing more than hard work. If you stick it out, that's where you get your results. So I know all of you are quite impressionable. You're what, class 8 to 12? What is 8 to 12 here? 9 to 12. So 9 to 12, everyone's telling you study hard, do well in your boards, and that's important. That's very important. I think it's like M.F. Hussain said. He said, you can go and be as creative as you like, but first you must know how to draw a horse. So, you can go and do whatever you want later, but you must have a solid foundation. You must, and just because I see a lot of children, and there's nothing wrong with it, who say we want to go and do a BBA. Oh, I want to study. You want to specialize very early. I had a very general education. I did a liberal arts education where I took classes in biology, in art history, in Urdu, in all of those things while at Mount Holyoke. And I think the best education is a well-rounded education. In investment banking, today you could be on a deal in oil and gas. You could be working for Saudi Aramco. Tomorrow you could be, selling consumer products, Procter & Gamble, Gillette. So the ability to switch and to learn new things is very important. So your knowledge base must be as wide as possible. So I say, please take advantage of everything that is on offer today. Have a basic idea of physics, have a basic idea of chemistry, have a basic idea of biology, have a basic idea of everything till class 12. And only after that decide what it is that you really want to do. You don't need to study or do a BBA, and I went to investment banking and I did fairly well. But I was economics and mathematics. I'd never looked at a balance sheet in my life before I went to investment banking. But balance sheets are bookkeeping. It's accounting. You can learn it in 2 days. I would hire at Oxford and Cambridge. I would come here and I would hire at the IIMs in India. And the problem with hiring the IIM boys were I would look at resumes and they were IIT, IIM, and I would not hire them. I would put them aside and I would hire people who had Hindu IIM or St. Stephen's IIM, simply because a person who's done history honors or done economics honors and then gone to an IIM will have a better rounded view of the world and will make a better manager than somebody who's gone in and specialized in tech or in sciences at a very early age, because they tend to think inside a box. And the people I think do best in life is people who think outside the box. So what I want to tell you is, even if you're interested in the sciences, make sure that you also have some interest in the arts, right? And another thing I want to tell you all, that this is our country. A lot of young people, when I ask them about politics, they say, we're not interested in politics, as though it's like a badge of honor, right? You're only not interested in politics because nothing that is affecting you today is you're living in a world of privilege. Your own rights have never been taken away. You've never known hunger. You've never known poverty. Your parents have never been persecuted. Because of all those reasons, you can afford to say that I don't care about politics. Everywhere in the world where people are dispossessed, where privilege has been taken away, you cannot help but be interested in politics. Politics is not a dirty word. Politics is knowing what is happening in the organizational structure of our country and where we want to take it. Now, it's not about being BJP or being Congress or being Trinamool. That's not what it's about. Everyone can use one platform to do. But it's very important that you stay abreast of current affairs. You must know what's happening in your country. You must read the newspaper every single day. We lived in Assam in a tea garden when we were growing up, and we got the newspaper every 3 days. You would get the newspaper from Calcutta every 3 days. And one of the things my mother would make me do was to sit and read the newspaper aloud. We had the Assam Tribune, I remember. So that's something you must get in the habit of doing, is read the newspaper every day, know what's happening in the country, know what's happening in every state. It can only widen your knowledge, and then when you decide to take any road less traveled, you will have all the tools to succeed. you will have all the tools to succeed. The worst thing you can do is that you think you're going on a path and tomorrow something happens in your life when you're thrown off that path and you do not have the tools and you do not have the weapons to go and do something else. You must always have that in you, inside you, and you must have that courage to do that. And you know, there's a wonderful couplet by the poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz, and he says, वो लोग बड़े खुशकिस्मत थे, वो लोग बड़े खुशकिस्मत थे, जो काम से आशिकी करते थे, जो काम से आशिकी करते थे. Do you get what I'm saying? There are a lot of people who are very fortunate, who love what they do. या इश्क को काम समझते थे, or think that being in love is actually work, right? It says हम जीते जी मसरूफ रहे, कुछ इश्क किया, कुछ काम किया, right? So while I was very busy during my life, I loved a little and I worked a little. So I think it's very important to love what you do, to be in love and work, but to do a bit of both. That's very important. I think this is a couplet that I carry with me. So that's about it. I'm sorry, I'm actually got a very high fever and I'm feeling not very thin, but and another thing that I wanted to tell all of you was that sometimes people ask me, is it difficult being a woman? I get a lot of questions about gender, as a lot of you young people ask me about gender, and they say, is it difficult being a woman politician? Is it difficult being a woman in parliament? There are only 78 of you. There are only a little more than 600 women who have ever been elected to Indian parliament since independence. I'm one of a club of 600. I'm one of a club of 78 now. Is it difficult? And I always say one thing. I said, I don't think of myself as a woman. I think of myself as a politician. I think of myself, even when I was a banker, I think of myself as a banker. So whatever you do, think of yourself as what you're doing rather than let your gender define you. Right? So if you're a doctor, you're a doctor first. And yes, then no one asks a man, I must tell you to all the women there, no one asks a man how is it difficult being a man. So why do we always suffer from being told, I said, no, I'm a politician. That's the end of that. Tell me if I'm a good politician or a bad politician, but don't ask me what has my gender got to do with it. So that is something I think young girls, in order to level the field, you must get to a point where in your own head, you're so far beyond this boy-girl thing that no one even dares to ask you. That no one even dares to ask you. Do you get what I'm saying? Yeah? So that's whatever you want to do, you just do what you have to do. And that's it. That's it. You will be defined by what you do rather than your gender. And at least in my lifetime, I have seen the number of these questions get reduced over time. Hopefully by the time you grow up, another 20 years' time, this will get even better and we'll be living in a world which will be much more of an even playing field than it is. So are there any more questions? Should I take some questions? Kids, do you want some questions?
So ma'am, I will be moderating today's question session with you. That's a great speech, by the way. Sorry for not mentioning that before. So if there are any questions, the children can approach the mic.
Yeah, just put your hand up and we'll take them. Don't tell me there are no questions, guys. Come on. Prefects and boys and girls in uniforms don't get to ask questions. Who are the other ones? Give me prepared questions. Just tell me what you think.
So, ma'am, I just read the questions. There are 3 interconnected questions. So, they're just going to ask it together and can answer in just one culminated answer.
Sure.
Okay?
Good morning, ma'am. You started your political career with Youth Congress and switched to TMC in 2010. What was the reason for this change in political affiliation?
There was actually no great reason. The Congress in Bengal had really, everyone had gone to Mamata Banerjee by then. So I was going to work at the booth level and there were very few Congress workers left at the booth level. So when I was doing rural work, I would go to villages and you wouldn't even find 10 Congress boys. So for me, it was purely as a sort of a platform to keep continuing to do my work. And in Bengal, there is no Congress. Mamata took the Congress and she took everyone with it. So it was, it wasn't some great ideological thing that I went to. It was just pure necessity.
Good morning, ma'am. Recently, the Karnataka government fell as many MLAs deflected from...
Did your mother write this question and your father write this question, or did you write this?
I wrote it.
You wrote it. Okay, then put the book down and tell me yourself. Yes.
So, since they defected from Congress to BJP, so what is the difference, or like what does it mean to be in a party, and how is it different when you defect as an elected representative and as just a member of the party?
Okay, so there's something known as an anti-defection law in our country, which doesn't work very well, unfortunately. I think the law does need to be repealed. It's a very toothless law. So the anti-defection law basically says if you've got elected on a certain ticket, so if I've got elected on a Trinamool ticket, or if Kumaraswamy in Karnataka has got elected on a JDS ticket, after I've got elected and I'm already an MLA or an MP, I can't just switch to another party, okay? I can't switch. I have to take 2/3 of the party with me. There has to be a merger, only then. Otherwise, I stand disqualified. Because you see, if people have voted you in, if people have voted you, what is your name? Sarah. So Sarah, suppose you're standing on a BJP ticket from Safdarjung. People have voted you. A month later, you decide you don't want to be with BJP, you want to get. Actually, you are betraying the mandate of the people. People have voted you as a BJP representative. And if you go somewhere else, you are betraying the mandate of the people. It's not fair. Yeah? If 2/3 of your party goes, then that's different. So that's the anti-defection law. But in India, the anti-defection law is applied very loosely. So you'll see a lot of this horse trading goes on. For example, in Karnataka, what happened was the BJP on its own had 105, and the JDS and the Congress together had 117 together, right? So they were in coalition. But over time, the one party or other does horse trading in our country, which is basically offer MLAs money to switch over, you switch over, there's going to be a trust vote, and then you vote with us, and then we'll form the government. But in this case, what's happened is the speaker has actually disqualified these 17 MLAs. So if there's a by-election now, these 17 MLAs for the rest of the term cannot contest again. So their reason for going over has actually not been proven. But with these 17 going, the Congress and the JDS have gone down to 100 and something. And the BJP have 105. So the new BJP government will be formed. So you see, this is what happens. Anti-defection law came into our country to prevent elected representatives from betraying the mandate of the people, that if people have elected you on a certain ticket, you should, in morality, in law, serve out the 5 years of your term on that ticket and with that party. And that's supposed to, there are laws to prevent you, but very often in India, the speaker doesn't disqualify you, ruling parties put pressure, and the situation continues, and governments fall as a result of this. So, we need to actually strengthen the anti-defection law in this country. Is that clear? Okay.
Good morning, ma'am. So in today's time, do you think being a parliamentarian is a search for or a way to power and money? Or do you think it's a commitment to the belief that the representatives were elected upon?
I wish it was a way to power and money. I could do with a lot more power and a lot more money, I can tell you. Right? Definitely do with a lot more money. The amount they pay us. Anyway, but it is what you make of it. You can be a councillor. I have seen councillors and corporators and panchayat pradhans who didn't have houses, who were on cycles, and 5 years later they've got pakka houses with marble and are roaming around in, as we call in Bengal, char chakka gadis, right? And you've seen parliamentarians here, every 5 years when they declare their assets, they start off with 70 lakhs, and after a 15-year thing, have an asset declaration of, 200 crores. So it is what you make of it. There are honest people everywhere, there are dishonest people everywhere. But I think thankfully in this country, there are still enough people. It is, like I said, it is what you make of it. It's always what you make of it. If you want to be corrupt and you want to use it for what it is, that's also there. But I think, like I said, I'm living proof that it's possible to do without bending the rules. It's possible to do without being corrupt. It's possible to do, and there are a lot of us in there. So it's very possible to do what you do, because I couldn't wake up every morning. There's no amount of money. I had a job that paid me more than enough to buy what I wanted, to take care of my parents, to live a good life. So for me, the opportunity cost of doing this was very high. So there's, doing this for money made no sense for me, and I couldn't wake up every morning and do what I do. If you're there working 12 hours a day in the conditions that we work in, there's no amount of money that can make up for it. Honestly, you couldn't do it. So I think there are enough of us, and that's why this country runs. And not just, I would say, not just politicians, it's actually bureaucrats. There are a lot of very, very good bureaucrats in the country on whom this country runs. And we must remember that, because I've seen a lot of times that you have a minister who's completely inadequate. For getting elected in this country, there is no bar to educational qualifications. People elect somebody who's passed class 4. People elect people who passed class 8. And whereas you have an IAS officer who's a very smart person, and you see the minister can't understand the files, but the IAS officer is doing all the work. So I think that the bureaucracy in our country also plays a very large part in getting work done. So the answer to your question is that yes, there are people who do it for power and money, as there are people who do it for power and money everywhere. But there are enough people who do it because they need to do it. Otherwise, this country would have never progressed.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else?
Good morning, ma'am. There has been much discussion on two famous articles of the Indian Penal Code.
You put your book away and say, I don't want anything which your mother father has written for you. You say it from your own mind.
That is Article 499 and 500. It is believed that it contradicts the freedom of speech and expression. And
What is the Article 499 500?
The defamation law,
Okay.
which makes defamation a criminal and civil offense.
Right.
So, and it obliterates journalistic freedom. So, what are your views on this law?
Well, I've just filed a criminal defamation against Zee News. And freedom of speech and expression, as everywhere else, is not a license to lie and destroy people's careers. You must understand this. I'm all for speech and expression, but unfortunately, media and journalistic standards in our country have fallen to an abysmal low. And I have absolutely no hesitation in saying this. I've said this before on record. I think, when we grew up, we would wait to read the editorial in the Statesman. We would wait to read the editorial in the Calcutta Telegraph. Today, when I look at the editorial, it's poor grammar. It's frightening. It's frightening. So when you have media ownership, there are all the 5 big media houses of this company are owned by one man. So when you have media ownership that is concentrated and you have strange links to government, then there is always a hidden agenda. So I think 498, 500 make very good sense in a world where there is true journalistic freedom and true journalistic ethics. In a world where there are hidden agendas and people are using journalists to bring down governments or to malign people's reputations, then I think there has to be some recourse to law. But of course, for example, I gave my speech, my maiden speech, and I used a poster which was in the Holocaust Museum, which talked of 14 different signs of fascism, right? I used 7 signs from it. I said in my speech, these are the 7 signs that I think are applicable to India, and I elaborated on each one of them. The Sudhir Chaudhary or some news anchor from Zee, I don't even watch Hindi channels because I'm not a Hindi speaker, my constituency is not a Hindi speaker, but there's a channel called Zee which ran a primetime show, a 7-minute show, which said that Mahua Moitra has stolen her speech from an article by so-and-so in the US. Right? Now, what is it to me? I had Rajnath Singh, the Home Minister of India, come to me in the Parliament lobby and tell me, "Aapne bada acha bola, par wo to thoda gadbad ho gaya na, aapne wahan se liya tha." So people are believing that. I don't have the reach to reach all these people who are watching the Zee program. So what is my recourse? Do I keep quiet and expect it to go and expect lakhs and millions of people in this world, even if 5% of them believe Mahua Moitra stole her speech? That's not something I want. So what do? I have to file criminal defamation. What else do I do? So sometimes I don't believe it as something that we need to do all the time, but given the lack of journalistic ethics in our country, given the great, I would say, sort of intertwining of a section of the government and media, sometimes there's no option left. Anything else?
Good morning, ma'am. My question is
What is the time, madam?
So ma'am, I'm a student of class 12 and I have studied political science for 2 years.
Lovely.
So as much I have read in political science about the ideas and the policies introduced by our government, so my question is only that rises in my mind is in spite of having good policies and ideas from our great leaders, why does politics always get influenced by some powerful or influential social groups?
As in what?
As in ma'am, we have great policies introduced by our leaders in our country, but still, for example, for the peasants and for the who works on the lands or the farms, we have policies for them, but still they get influenced because of the rich landowners and many other things.
But that's our country. It's a very complicated answer. There's no easy answer. We are a country, our own history makes our country. We've always been a country that has liked to be divided, like I always said. People say India is this great thing where everybody is one and everyone thinks alike, and it's not. India is one of the most racist countries in the world, right? Everyone who's fairer hates somebody who's darker. This is the truth. This is the truth. We must accept it. This is our country, and I love my country, but this is also true. So we will go to Australia and we will complain. Indians will complain in Australia of racism, but that same Indian will behave terribly with a Nigerian diplomat in Delhi. This is the truth. So, this is the pecking order. So when you talk about social groups or things like that, we have always grown up. And this is a fact actually, Mrs. Koshi. This is a fact, and this is something, kids, these are class 9 to class 12. They must understand this. There's no point, this is not a sign of no unpatriotism. This is the truth. This is the truth. Even till today, when we talk of social evils or social groups, how many of you, when you grow up and you want to get married, will go and marry the person you like without your parents not thinking about what caste they're marrying? So even when you think of some things like that we can't even stop in our own families because of the whole social cultural history of India. So when you obviously go into villages, then things like that do happen. But I do think that in India now, what's happening is the distribution mechanism is getting a lot better. So we are not relying on landlords or relying on anyone else to give out government policies. Our reach through the SDOs, through the district magistrate, through the subdivisional officers, through the block development officers is getting better and better. And I think that, government policies we are trying to do last mile distribution and last mile connectivity, and it is improving. So it's not where we want it to be, but it is improving. But that's anything else?
Good morning, ma'am.
Yeah.
Ma'am, in your iconic maiden speech in the parliament, you had spoken about 7 points, 7 signs which prove that India's constitution is under threat and the core values on which this country was formed are under threat.
Yeah.
So one of the points which you spoke on was government's unimaginable control and subjugation of mass media.
Right.
So, ma'am, in today's world, and as you and I both know that the present government is actually increasing its control over various media platforms. So my question to you is that in today's world, today's world of digital media, how do you, what would be your suggestion to the youth on how to form your opinion and not be a victim of political propaganda?
This is a very, very good question, and if you keep your eyes and ears open, hopefully by this session, and we are fighting very hard in the opposition today, is we don't have a data protection law in India, okay? So we have nothing to protect your data. Tomorrow, my mother's got Facebook, or you guys have, say, TikTok. So when you're opening an account, they ask you for this permission. They ask you for, if you've noticed, if you go to Google and you want to buy say you want to buy Levi's jeans, and you type in Levi's jeans. If you go to your Facebook, you'll see an ad there for Levi's jeans. Have you all noticed this? Yeah? So how is it linked? They're obviously tracking what you're doing, consumer behavior. Now there is no, for example, my mother, she's on Facebook because she wants to do video calling with her grandchildren. Most of our parents are now on Facebook and all of these. My mother has no idea on what she should take yes to, what she should take no to, what she should share. She's on it for us. So most of our country who are on social media are users, but they're not really literate users. So because of that, we don't have data protection laws. For example, now WhatsApp, we have TikTok, all of these people are being where you can just forward the most dangerous propaganda fake videos. I think this election, the biggest thing that was, the worst thing about this election was it was fought on fake news. It was fought on propaganda. It was, you could take, for example, there were so many of these videos. They use a killing which happened in Bangladesh in 2002 and they changed it and they say it's Bengal 2018. And people see that and they forward it and there's a riot. So there is actually no law which enables us right now to take action against this kind of intermediary behavior, because WhatsApp, Facebook, that they're all hiding under the fact that we are intermediaries. We are not putting up content. Somebody else is using us to put up content. But you can't absolve yourself. For example, if some thief is stolen something and he comes to your house to take shelter, then you are also equally responsible in that. It's called aiding and abetting a crime. So if that applies in the Indian Penal Code for aiding and abetting a crime, then for social media, one cannot hide under this intermediary garb. So we are fighting very hard to bring in this data protection law. And I will tell you something very, very seriously. All you kids are on Facebook. The fake news that is out there is incredible. You will not even know. There are some websites called Alt News and a few other fact-checking websites that do it. So whatever you read it with a pinch of salt. And make sure whatever you read, when you do your research, do primary research. So if you are getting something from somewhere, get it from example, don't do a Google search, go to the actual site to get it. So always do primary research rather than get somebody who's written about 5 things. It might be quicker, but I would say stick to primary research sources, and before you write anything, fact check it 5 times. So that's what I would tell people. Is that okay?
Thank you very much, ma'am.
You're very welcome.
Those were great answers.
Thank you very much. I can see your principal. Was I a little too candid, Mrs. Koshi? Was that because, I always think that I try to treat kids, I think at this age, are all little mini adults anyway. So they all know and think. So it's been really wonderful being here. And wish you all the very best of luck. And good luck with everything. Have a wonderful time. And I hope I will come back again sometime soon to see you all. Thank you.